It's okay, you're talking.
I'm not talking yet.
Welcome to our July Core Advocate webinar, The Problem of Teaching Literacy Backwards. We're going to get started in just a minute here, and thank you to everyone who has already answered our Core Advocate webinar poll up on the screen. Feel free to just take a few last moments to answer how many Core Advocate webinars you've already attended with us, and then we'll get started in just a moment. On your control panel on your screen, you should see a place where you can download the handouts for tonight, so you can take a moment to do that as well before we get started. Okay, welcome again to our July Core Advocate webinar. You see on the screen the answers to our first poll question. It looks like for many of you, it is your very first Core Advocates webinar, so thank you so much for joining us and welcome. And we have a few Core Advocate All-Stars with 1 to 8 or 9 to 14 webinars. Thanks for coming back to see us again. Tonight we have a great webinar planned for you entitled The Problem of Teaching Literacy Backwards. It is our July Core Advocate webinar. We have these each month. We have another one planned next month, which we'll tell you about a little bit at the end. And we're going to get started right now. Great. I am one of your hosts from the professional learning team, Tori Filler. I'm also here with my colleagues, Jenny and Nicole, and we have some absolutely fabulous guests this month. We have David Levin, SAP Senior Fellow, and Aaliyah Washington, who will be our Core Advocate guest. You'll find out a little bit more about them in just a bit, but they are going to be fabulous, and we're so glad you're here with us tonight. As it is the first time for many of you on the line tonight, wanted to tell you a little bit about what who are the Core Advocates. Core Advocates it is a national network of educators that's over 13,000 strong, and Core Advocates believe in the importance of college and career ready standards for all students and work together to support each other and their communities with implementing these standards to ensure that all students have access through classroom instruction, curricular resources, and aligned assessment. If you'd love to learn a little bit more about the Core Advocates, feel free to email us directly. Jenny's email address is on the screen there. And at the end, we'll be showing a link, underneath is a link for a survey where you can join our database. We send out a great monthly newsletter as well as information about new resources that are popping up all the time on our website, achievethecore.org. If you haven't checked it out yet, feel free to type that into your search browser and give it a go. And we have many Core Advocates who are active on social media. If you are one of those, we definitely encourage you to tweet tonight during the webinar or at any time following tonight. You can find us using the hashtag Core Advocates, and feel free to tag us on your tweets. There's some handles listed on the screen. Great. Tonight, we'd love to interact with you on with a few different ways using our webinar platform. You've already done one of those ways by completing the poll at the beginning of this webinar. You can also access the documents or the handouts on the handout section of your control panel. And there's a question tab. That question tab will remain open throughout the webinar. And if you have a question at any time, you can enter it in there. David Levin loves questions, so please use that feature tonight. We'll also be pausing at specific points to ask questions during the webinar. You won't see other participants' questions as they come in, but we may answer questions and then share both the question and the response with all participants. As I said, we'll also have another poll for you to answer a little bit later. At the end of the webinar, a survey will pop up, and we'd love to know how you felt we did tonight and what we can do better next time around. So please take a few moments to answer that at the very end. And you'll be receiving an email in a few days with access to this recorded webinar. We'll also be posting the recorded webinar and the PowerPoint materials on our website, Achieve the Core. Feel free to download it and use it as you see fit. All of our resources are free and available for you to use on our website. All right, now to the good stuff. We have several goals for tonight's webinar. The first is that we're going to review some recent educational research as well as cognitive science works on building strong readers. And after we review that research, we're going to think about instructional methods that are aligned and unaligned with this evidence base. And finally, we're going to hear about one district's transition to a structured phonics program and a knowledge-rich curriculum. All right. Our first section of learning will be thinking about this question: what does new research tell us about building strong readers? So in a moment, you're going to see a poll pop up on your screen, and we'd love for you to answer it. What percentage of your students are fluent readers of grade level text? And if you're in a kindergarten through second grade setting, what percentage of your students are on track to being fluent readers of grade level text? If you work at a district or in a different type of educational organization, feel free to answer this question to the best of your knowledge for whatever students or schools you work with. Great, thank you so much for participating in that poll. We have a big range here, as expected. It looks like for most of us, we're working at between 41 and 60% of our students are fluent readers of grade level text, and there's a wide variety on the screen. We'd love for you to think about how you answered this question as you hear about the next section of the presentation and some new research that's come out, telling us why and how students become fluent readers of grade level text. And I'm going to hand it off now to the great David Levin. He is a senior fellow at Student Achievement Partners, and he's going to tell you a little bit about himself right now.
Okay, hi everybody out there in the great American states. I hope that you'll still listen to me even though you now see that I am a Yankee fan. Okay, I have been involved with Student Achievement Partners since the beginning. I am not one of the writers of the Common Core standards. I was at the table when they were written, at the desks, involved in it all along with my wife, Meredith. If you're ever curious, much of them were written on 14th Street in Manhattan, but approved and verified by many others all around. What my role was to synthesize the research behind the Common Core standards, much of which is in Appendix A, and with my wife, Meredith, to run a research project with people from Metametrics who do Lexiles and other computational linguistics like that to determine what the complexity level should be in each of the grades, since the Common Core standards made complexity a standard, as you know. I came into the standards business because David Coleman, one of the primary architects of the standards, with Sue Pimentel, reached out to us after they saw that our school, which was 100% free and reduced price lunch, went from the lowest scoring school in the city of New York, which is impressive, to one of the highest performing schools in all of Harlem, where our school was located. We did that basically by changing from what at the time was called whole language to a structured or systematic phonics program, and also to a curriculum that grew knowledge. And we're going to talk about both of those today. Next slide, please. Or am I controlling the slides? Okay, the two pieces of research we're going to discuss. One on the left is a study done by David Page, a literacy researcher, and the other one is by a cognitive neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, who studies how the brain wraps itself around text and has been studying that for about 20 years. Next slide, please. Let's start with David Page's research. Take a look at those bullets for a moment, please. Okay, this study was the result of work with these third graders in the lowest performing school in a large, very, very low performing district in the Southeast. And it involved roughly 90 to 180 hours of teacher training, but more closer to 90 in systematic or structured phonics. At the end of that time, at the end of the third grade, some students had teachers who'd done this training for 1 year, some for 2, very few for 3. But they assessed these students with a standardized phonics assessment at the end of third grade. Next slide, please. And here's how that assessment works. The top part is called phonetically regular nonsense word decoding. So you have words that are they're not words, they're pseudo words like bap, reap, slipe, and traping. The idea here is a student has never seen slipe, S-L-I-P-E, before, but if they've learned the spelling sound patterns of the English language, the long I in this case, and the consonant blends, then they're going to be able to read other words that have that same spelling sound pattern. And the same with traping and bap and reap. The way this assessment is done is students are given a number of words and they're assessed on how many they can read correctly and accurately in a 1-minute period. This is important because it's not just are they accurate. If the student takes a look at slipe and spends 20 seconds figuring out that it's slipe, that's not really that good. It should be basically less than a second. So that's one part of this assessment. The other part is called sight word decoding. Not sight words as in high frequency words, as that term is sometimes used, but this is words that words just like these, send, campground, cranberry, a list of them is presented and it's recorded how many of these words students can pronounce correctly in 1 minute. And I think the baseline was in the neighborhood of about 645 of these words. Again, it's accuracy and speed or automaticity in how so when they see the word campground, they're supposed to say it right away, campground or cranberry, not look at it for 10 seconds and go cranberry. Spelling knowledge, another standardized test called the developmental screening inventory, a 20-word inventory. And again, these words are in stages of phonetic complexity. You can see bump and mud and jet are not that complex, but when you go to stage 2, make and car and cheer and boat are more complex, and so on. And again, these words are dictated to students and they spell them. The idea here being, if you look at stage 3 with the word lesson, if you can spell lesson, you will be able to read lesson automatically. If you can spell the next word, advice, you can read it. So it's spelling as a measure of students' ability to recognize and read words. And then there's fluency, a curriculum-based, what's called a curriculum-based passage. And it's in about the 700 to 800 Lexile level, which is where it should be roughly at the end of third grade. And they're scored on how many words correct per minute, which in the end of third grade on a text at the Lexile band that you're supposed to have according to the standards at the end of third grade, you should be reading in the neighborhood of 95 to 100 words correct per minute. Next slide, please. Here's what they found out, but first we're going to ask you a question. They wanted to know students who were solid on foundational skills, who passed that assessment, all the parts of it, the spelling knowledge, the pseudo word, the sight word, and the reading fluency, what chance did they have of passing the state assessment? Now, before you make your guess, keep in mind that they were in the lowest performing, one of the lowest performing schools in an extremely low performing district. And the program that they used, well, a lot of you know it, it's Journeys. It did not have much knowledge building, and it did not have much vocabulary building. So how do we do this now? People are going to make a guess, right?
Yes, feel free to type your guess into the question box.
Okay, so somebody just tell me what to do and when to continue talking.
A lot of different guesses popping in between 40 and 80%.
Have a sense of where the data mostly resided?
Yes, it looks like most folks are going for the higher end, so above 60% or above 50%. One participant asked a great question about whether attendance was also considered, which is interesting.
Attendance also considered. I'm pretty sure not. Pretty sure not. Okay.
I agree, David. I don't think that was a factor.
Say that again.
I said I agree. I did not think that was accounted for in this study,
Right.
but I can't wait to find out what the answer is, David.
Okay, the answer is 70%, a 70% chance of passing the third grade test. You estimated high, which is interesting. I think this is a really startling finding because the program they were in, as I said, did not grow knowledge, did not grow vocabulary, but yet students who passed the phonics assessment had a 70% chance. Students who did not pass the phonics assessment had a 20% chance. This is really a stunning finding because we're talking about third grade being so pivotal. Many of you may know of legislation in 13 states that states that if students do not pass the third grade reading test, they do not go on to the fourth grade. And yet apparently this phonics knowledge is essential to passing the third grade assessment. And these students were taught in a structured phonics program. Next slide, please. Structured phonics works, sometimes called systematic phonics. The research on this is like crazy. The National Reading Panel back in 2000 is what's called a meta study, a study of studies. They took 600 or 700 studies and they eliminated about 550 or so. And they just took the 100 or so best studies and they all showed that a systematic phonics program is the best way to teach all students beginning reading and foundational skills, but especially students from low-income families. The Institute of Education Sciences is essentially the research wing of the Federal Department of Education. Well, we still have that. And they will no longer do any kind of study having to do with phonics because they've made it clear that systematic phonics is by far the best way to teach beginning reading foundational skills to all students. If you want more on this, my paper written with David, with this literacy researcher, David Page, is on our website. It's why structured phonics program is effective. Next slide, please. So how do we teach foundational skills? And take a look at what's written on the left side of the screen. And some of you can hopefully see the module. This comes from a program, EL Education, used to be called Expeditionary Learning, that has a systematic structured phonics program. And the way they do it is the way research says to do it, by introducing and teaching discrete phonetic skills, short vowel sounds, vowel digraphs, consonant digraphs, long vowel sounds in a sequence. Teach it in a sequence, and then teach it in context, meaning in decodable readers or books that have those words, mostly those words. Out of context, which means lessons and games and worksheets. And good news, we have solid evidence that if you use a worksheet, you won't go to hell, because worksheets can be very handy in this kind of thing because kids can do it by themselves. So it's introduce it, follow a discrete series of hierarchical skills, teach each one directly, in context and out of context. Out of context, again, being lessons and games, and worksheets. In context being the readers, and assess it, preferably every week, but certainly as no longer than every 3 weeks or so. That's how foundational skills is supposed to be taught based on this research, which is overwhelming research. Next slide, please. With this explicit instruction and practice, we become more skilled decoders. And basically, here's how it's worked. If you're introducing the OR spelling pattern or phonic pattern, as in work or worm or war, if students are introduced to that, taught that directly, practice that, they may never see the word war, but they know that spelling pattern, so they can recognize the word war. And it's probably in their vocabulary. They know what war means and what warn means. Maybe not as many wart, but when they see it, they'll be able to recognize it and maybe figure it out from context. They may never been exposed to the word wart or the word warn, but by given this pattern, they can learn those words. It's the redundancy, the repetition that allows that to happen. Some children need way more repetition than others. Some don't need nearly as much, but those who need a lot often need quite a bit. So a good structured phonics program has the opportunity for practice and repetition. And again, I urge you to look at that paper, because everything I'm talking about is in that paper, and it's a much better, more thorough explanation than I can give you in the time we have allotted to us. Next slide, please. Take a look at the top, which reiterates what we've been saying. You've got to follow a scope and sequence where you plan, teach, assess, plan, teach, assess. And students know on any given day what pattern they're learning. By the way, another advantage of this in a structured phonics program, if students are absent, because raise your hand if you don't have any problems with students being absent or late, you know exactly what they missed in a systematic phonics program. With a traditional guided reading program, you don't have that advantage. Next slide, please. Okay, we're moving out of foundational skills into traditional literacy comprehension instruction. So how does traditional literacy comprehension instruction get it wrong? Next slide, please. Okay, Nicole, are you taking over for me, or Tori?
Yes, we've got you, David. We'd love for you all to answer a question now in the question box. And actually, David, before we do this, there was a bunch of questions that came in about the past study, and just wanted to clarify now while we're still on this topic about whether these third graders were already proficient by the time they reached third grade based on their K-2 instruction in foundational skills and phonics, or not.
0% were proficient, and 100% were free and reduced price lunch. And that's a good question.
Got it. So the third graders that were used for this study, we don't know whether they had solid foundational skills instruction in K-2. We only know that they definitely had a third grade teacher that went through this training, correct?
Some of them might have had a teacher earlier that did it, and they were unable to trace that because getting that kind of data out of school systems. But on the other hand, some of them didn't have it in third grade. They only had it in second, or some only had it in first. So what we know, these are good questions. What we know is those students who did master it, whether they had 1 year or 2 years, those students had this extraordinarily high chance of passing. And those students did not, based on any of the earlier assessments, were not necessarily doing that well. And they were 100% free and reduced price lunch.
Great, really interesting. So we can tell a lot about what a likely outcome is for a student who has solid foundational skills based on this study.
Exactly.
Great.
Exactly.
Great. Thanks for clarifying, David. So as David said, we were going to switch now and think a little bit about the other piece of this equation, looking more at reading comprehension. There was a lot of questions that came in about, but what about reading comprehension to complement this piece about foundational skills? So we're going to shift there now. And we'd love for you to answer this question in the question box about how you usually begin planning a lesson about a central text or an anchor text. And we'll give you a few minutes. I see some answers already popping in.
Great. Thank you for those of you who have already begun to type answers to this question in the question tab. Like Tori said at the beginning of the webinar, you can't see what each other type and respond, but Tori and I will begin sharing those out as we respond so you can see other people's responses. But I'm seeing two main themes in the responses so far. Most people are either saying that they begin with the text, they start by reading the text themselves, or they dig deeply into the text, and then many people are also saying they start with the standards. So looking at the standards or digging into the standards for their grade level and looking at which standards they need to teach. So those are kind of the two main ways that I'm seeing that people are responding to this question. So again, feel free to continue typing in your responses and we'll share some of them out. But we're going to go ahead and go back to David to think about this question with us as well.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Well, let's go right to the point. There is a problem with doing it standards first or doing it by standard or by skill, a comprehension strategy such as main idea or prediction or making an inference or drawing a conclusion, or standard such as this week we're going to work with standard 5, the point of view standard, or standard 6, the structure standard. And there's a problem with that. If you take a book like As the Snowy Day and you teach one day character, one day you're talking about character, another day you're talking about plot, another day you're talking about standard 3, the interaction standard. There's two huge problems with that. One is it's not the way proficient readers read. We don't go home and read an article in a paper or read a novel and say, well, I'm going to concentrate on theme today, or I'm going to concentrate on theme this week. And I'm really psyched because next week I'm going to do predicting, and next week and the week after that, I'm going to come to draw some conclusions. That's not the way proficient readers read. There's no evidence in the world to show that. That's one problem with it. Another problem with it is if you give a lesson and you ask students to focus on one standard or one skill or one strategy, good children who are good readers are going to ignore that. They're not going to raise their hand and say, I'm not doing that, Mr. Levin. But good reading is to a great extent a habit. And good readers look for everything in a text. They don't focus on one thing. So weak readers, however, they're going to say, I just need to look to make a prediction. So I am going to read here to kind of come up with something to make a prediction. And they will pass over absolutely everything. They'll pass over anything that has to do with character, anything that has to do with theme, anything that has to do with setting, because they're reaching out to prediction as a life jacket, as a lifeline, because they don't do well with reading. They don't like it if they're a weak reader, and they have trouble with it, whether it's at their text at their level or not. And we're essentially telling them to do something that the research says is all backwards and has no basis for it. And it's a large part of the reason why we have had this opportunity gap for over a quarter of a century. One reason, of course, is foundational skills. This is another reason. Next slide, please.
David, could I ask a clarifying question? Do you mean, what types of texts are you talking about? Are you talking about texts that are meant to support foundational skills, or are you talking about another type of text?
Good. We're not talking about foundational skills text at all here. We're talking about text used to teach reading comprehension, whether they are texts for leveled readers or texts in a leveled reading system, or text where students are reading a text at grade level, in a shared read or in a close read, but we are not talking about foundational skills. Thank you, Tori.
Of course.
Okay, good readers draw on many skills and strategies based on what they need to comprehend the text. And there's a series of work called Standard of Coherence done by a group of cognitive psychologists in Europe and the United States that looked at the habits of good readers. And what they found is that the very best readers, the most proficient readers, looked for everything a text has to offer, expected to get everything a text has to offer. And that kind of approach is what is needed. And it's the opposite of looking for one skill at a time. Next slide, please. Read that for a moment. The text needs to drive the standard. The text is the one that tells you which standards are most important. And in many texts, you need to deal with all of them. A full and deep understanding of a text is going to require certainly standard one, getting evidence from the text and making inferences. It's going to require standard two, getting a sense of the main idea or the theme. It's going to require standard three, the interaction of plot, sequence, and events. A good reader looks for everything and uses everything in the text. So when we instruct that way, we need to instruct with a text-first approach. Just today, I was asked to look at a program called Collaborative Literacy or something like that, that got the foundational skills standards right, but when they came to this, did exactly the opposite of what they were supposed to do. There was a beautiful text about Rosa Parks for third graders, and all of the questions had to do with what the standard of the week was or the standard of the day. And there were very little questions about what Rosa Parks did, why she did it, why did people react that way? Because the focus was on the specific standards of that day or that week. This just does not work. Okay, next slide, please. And take a look at this. And this is going into assessment. Think about this as assessment for a minute. If you look at the multiple choice question you've got there, so Derek and the narrator started to make fish faces, and what happens next in the story? It upsets Dad, and the boat almost sinks. And the idea being that this is addressing character 3, standard 3 for the third grade with literacy, traits, motivations, or feelings, explain how actions contribute to the sequence of events. Well, the child might have gotten that question wrong because they didn't understand much of the text. They might have gotten confused because of any of these constructs that you see here. Vocabulary, syntax, fluency, they didn't read fluently. There was too much information presented, density of information. They didn't know about boats, or they didn't know about sinking. So they didn't have the knowledge demands. To make the claim that it's strictly related to the standard doesn't work. The standard is in many respects not the cause of the comprehension, but the effect of the comprehension. The cause of the comprehension is, for the most part, vocabulary, fluency, ability to deal with syntax, ability to deal with dense information, stamina, knowledge demands. And when all these are in place, then you can answer a question that addresses a standard. And your understanding of the standard comes about as an effect of that, not so much a cause of that. If you had to have standards in order to teach reading, then nobody would have learned to read before roughly 1988, because there were no standards, state or Common Core. Okay, next slide, please. With assessment, what many schools do is just what we've been talking about. They look at question 7 and they say, question 7 addresses standard 5, the point of view standard. And kids got it wrong. So I'm going to bear down on point of view. We're going to do more lessons in point of view. We're going to read some texts that are good for point of view. When in fact, you have no way of knowing that that's the reason they got that question wrong, other than sitting down with the child or the class and have a conversation about what they were thinking at that point and what they understood about the text at that point. Just going by the standard is a smooth road because question 7 is clearly mapped to standard 5. It is a smooth road in the wrong direction. Sitting down with the class, analyzing the text, going through different children's thought patterns, asking them about words that they understood at that point, or what they were thinking, or looking at earlier answers to see if that gave you information, that's a rough road. But it's a rough road in the right direction. Next slide, please. Literacy instruction backwards. Everybody who can read the top word, raise their hand. Traditional literacy instruction isolates, teaches, assesses, and reteaches skills or standards. Instead, we should use this method for foundational skills and let the text guide our reading comprehension instruction. So in other words, we've got it ass backwards, gang. We are taking foundational skills and not breaking it up into a series of discrete hierarchical skills, but rather hoping that with traditional guided reading, whatever spelling patterns come up will be taught, and some teachers teach more and some teachers teach less. But any given text on a leveled reader could have a vast number of spelling of phonics patterns, and students may never have been exposed to them. The idea being that by seeing it over a period of time, they will make the connection. And that does work for some children, but it tends to work for children from educated families who've been read to a great deal, who've been asked inferential questions a great deal, and have even been given some instruction by parents or preschools in reading. But students who don't have all of that don't succeed with that approach. And that's a major reason for the opportunity gap we have. We're not giving those students the opportunity to succeed. Conversely, we take reading comprehension and do break that down into a series of discrete skills that we teach separately as opposed to as part of a whole, as part of the entire text. Next slide, please. To get some equity, to get equitable literacy instruction, we have to deal with accelerators, things that move students along. One is accurate and automatic decoding and fluency. Use systematic foundational skills instruction to solidify fluent reading of grade level text by grade 3. Once students are reading fluently, let the text guide your planning and ensure students have access to complex text with rich vocabulary and knowledge of the world, which doesn't mean that's the only text they should read, text in the band. But the other texts they read should also grow knowledge and grow vocabulary. The left part of this slide is clearly shown by the research that we mentioned, which we can send to anybody who wants to see it. Accurate decoding and fluency. The right part of the slide was the conclusion by this scientist, whose name is escaping me now, in the book that was on the first slide, that there's no reason to break comprehension down into a series of discrete skills. That's not the way the human brain wraps itself around reading.
Mark Seidenberg.
Thank you, Mark Seidenberg. One last thought. After the standards were approved, and those of us who were working with David Coleman and Sue Pimentel, and in the very few people that were with Student Achievement Partners in the very beginning, almost as a congratulatory moment, David Coleman got all of us together. He did not ask about let's dig into standard 6. Or aren't you really excited about standard 7 now? He read a beautiful excerpt from Genesis and asked us to think about that excerpt. In other words, to look at that text as a whole and talk about it. And I think that's as strong a message as I can send, that text first is really what the standards are all about. I'd like to since this is my last part, you're going to hear how we made these transitions in one school district, a really good example. But I'd like to thank the 316 people on a Thursday or Wednesday, whatever day of the week this is, it's the middle of the summer, who got on this webinar. I think that's really impressive and really speaks well of all of you. Okay, take it away, Tori or Nicole.
Great, David, we could not agree more, and the question box has been super interesting, so please keep it up. David, I know you can't wait to read all the questions that came in. We'll download them, get them over to you after this webinar.
And we'll be able to answer
we'd love to
and get them back to people, right, Tori?
Yes. So if there are a few questions that I tagged folks asking for additional resources and things, and we can do our best to answer those and put them into the email that you all receive with the recorded webinar and materials from tonight. Great. Many of you have been answering this question throughout, and really appreciate those responses in the question box, but would love for you to just take a moment to reflect on all that you've heard and all that David has been talking about tonight. What connections can you draw to your own teaching practice or whatever role that you play? And what might you be thinking about differently now that you've heard about these ideas that David has shared based on research? We'll give you a minute or two to write those your answers in the question box.
Thank you so much for sharing your thinking. Tori and I are going to pour over these and share out as many as we can. We love the enthusiasm and passion that we see in so many of the responses. I've seen multiple people say, what has changed, or how's your thinking different? And I've seen multiple people say everything about my thinking has been changed and different. So I think there's been maybe some really exciting ahas on the webinar tonight. So lots of people have said, I need to look into this more. I probably need to be doing more with my structured phonics than what's in my curriculum or my basal. I need to share this with other colleagues and with other teachers in the district. So I'm super excited about the responses and the changes in thinking that this has caused for many of you. And so I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Tori now, who's going to introduce our core advocate guest. And as Ali is talking, I'll share out as many of the responses as I can.
Great, thanks, Jenny. I also noticed many folks who are feeling a little bit shocked or maybe even a little guilty for some of the things that are happening in their classrooms or districts. And just wanted to say that I think all of us at some point likely have engaged in practices that don't exactly align with the things David's been talking about. So if you're feeling a little bit shaken to your core, that is absolutely okay. We're going to hear now in our next section about what it might look like to turn some of these things in the right direction. It is hard work, but worth doing. So I'm about to introduce our fabulous core advocate guest. Her name is Aaliyah Washington, and she is a lead coach in the Metro Nashville Public School District. She worked with us this past year on a pilot that started to implement some of these changes that we're talking about, and we can't wait to hear a little bit about her work, and she's going to share some of her lessons learned with you as well. So Aaliyah, take it away.
Okay. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to share with you what's been really transformative, not just for me, but also for many of the students, the kindergarten through first grade students here in Metro Nashville. So I want to start by saying the balanced literacy pilot that we engaged in, it was just in 9 of our schools. We have 74 elementary schools here in Nashville. But student achievement partners really came in about 3 times over the course of this past school year and supported teacher knowledge around foundational skills instruction and also building knowledge, using complex text to build knowledge through read alouds. So it really meant a shift in teacher instruction because we've been a balanced literacy school district in the traditional sense of balanced literacy for almost 20 years now. So guided reading, shared reading, interactive read aloud, those were all mainstays in our classroom. A word study approach, implicit phonics instruction where teachers would give students a brief touch of a phonics skill within a guided reading lesson. That was all very typical of the phonics instruction that occurred here in Nashville. And in terms of the read alouds that were taking place, the text wasn't necessarily complex and wasn't always connected to a content area. So just in both areas, we needed to make some significant shifts, but I would say especially in the area of foundational skills. So in those kindergarten and first grade classrooms, 45 minutes of their literacy block was devoted to phonological awareness and explicit phonics instruction. So that meant that they're teaching the standards, but they're teaching them in a way that most of our K and first grade teachers had not taught it in the past. So we did receive some support, and you can find those resources on achievethecore.org. The modules, the foundational skills modules are there, as well as the decodable protocols that they gave us to support that implementation. I think we're ready for the next slide. So what were some of the outcomes? First of all, we were shocked because it was about 4 months into the pilot. It was mid-year when we saw just really amazing results. So I would say first thing was the teachers were very enthusiastic and they were very open. So many of them had never been exposed to this knowledge about teaching reading in their teacher preparation programs or in the district level training that we had previously provided for them. You know, when I say we were a balanced literacy district, we were a balanced literacy district, but we very much leaned toward more of a whole language approach, I would definitely say. So when teachers were introduced to explicit phonological awareness instruction and explicit structured phonics, then it was definitely unfamiliar to many of them, but they were very enthusiastic, very open, very excited to go into their classrooms. Really, after only 2 days of training, they just jumped right in. Sometimes they had all the materials or were familiar with all the materials. Other times they were not. But most of the teachers jumped in and were very enthusiastic. The other positive were the gains in student achievement. So particularly in the area of the easy CBM measures. So some of you may be familiar with DIBELS or AIMSweb. Our district uses a easy CBM called FastBridge. Well, on the FastBridge assessments, these 9 schools that were in the balanced literacy pilot, they are historically underperforming schools. high EL populations, significant percentages of EE or exceptional education students, very diverse populations, students that are, most of the students, 90% or more on free and reduced lunch. So we're talking about students that often need a great deal of support and were chronically underperforming on these easy CBM measures, and just we've never seen any kind of progress on these measures, as well as the high stakes standardized tests that the 3rd and 4th grade students take at the end of the year. But after only a year, I'm just going to throw a few numbers out for you guys. So one school went from 24% of their students on benchmark at the beginning of this year, last year, to 53% on benchmark. So they more than doubled. Another school went from 15% of their students on benchmark at the beginning of the year to 63% of their students on benchmark. And again, that's after only, less than a year of training, just a few opportunities to receive support from student achievement partners. Teachers jumped right in, and there was fidelity to the structured phonics piece that I think really the outcomes surprised all of us in terms of how quickly students responded to structured phonics and explicit phonological awareness instruction. Okay, we're ready for the next slide. So what were some of the challenges? I want to say, number one, just the lack of knowledge, the lack of teacher knowledge about the reading research, really lack of educator knowledge about really over 40 years of reading research that's available, not just with the National Reading Panel, but years before that, and a lack of exposure to journals that use empirical research. So we were just hearing one side of the reading picture and not really getting a balanced approach, not hearing about explicit phonics instruction and the importance of phonological awareness. So we really saw teachers who were very excited about this shift, but felt, really felt passionate about maybe helping those students that had previously been in their classrooms, that they didn't have this knowledge to support. So it was very motivational for them. But for us, this is challenging because we're really having to take an extensive ongoing approach to professional development for all of our educators, so that our leadership, district leadership, as well as our principals and our literacy coaches also have a firm foundation and understanding of the evidence behind this approach to teaching reading. Everybody's well-intentioned and is working very hard, but sometimes you can be working hard around emphasizing the wrong kind of work. And so just needing support to shift people's thinking. Also, really needing to help principals and administrators to make sure their expectations for teacher practice are aligned to the research as well. So when they go in to evaluate, they have an understanding that if I see a phonics lesson, it should be explicit and systematic. And that's considered best practice in the area of literacy. It has been a shift for teachers. They had to spend a little less time with guided reading, but they saw the benefit because surprisingly, the students actually scored better than ever on the text level assessments. That was also a shocker. When we look at the Phonics and Pinnell text level assessments in several of these schools where they gave those assessments, but I think it was the combination of the knowledge building piece as well as explicit phonics instruction and phonological awareness instruction.
Great. Thank you so much, Aaliyah. It's fantastic to hear about the great work happening in Nashville, and I'm sure inspiring to a lot of folks in the line to hear about some first steps that you all took as a district to move in the right direction. Thanks so much, Aaliyah. We have just a few minutes left, and we've had so many fabulous questions come in. Jenny, I think that you wanted to start with one, and we'll see if we can get maybe sneak a second one in as well.
Great, thank you. David, I noticed that throughout the webinar, many people were asking about what is the recommendation for students who are above third grade, and is there phonics recommendations for students who are above third grade and are not yet reading on grade level? And I thought it would be a good opportunity to promote an archived webinar that you did earlier in the year around fluency, but I thought we could first hear your thoughts on what to do for students who are above third grade.
You can't just give them a structured phonics program and nothing else. It doesn't work when they're that old. They know it's not really reading. So you have to do a fluency-based approach and drop in phonics understandings as part of it. And as Jenny, I think, said, the webinar on fluency addresses that. The idea is that older kids, especially after the fourth grade or so, they want to know that they're doing something real. If they're only doing structured phonics with lessons and even with a decodable, they kind of know that that's not real. So you have to do a fluency approach. And we don't have time to explain an entire fluency approach, but it is in that webinar, and everything about fluency, everything. What is fluency? How do you teach it? How do you assess it? What about kids who are far behind at any grade is on our website. And maybe Jenny or Nicole could tell you exactly where, or you could just go and search fluency. So I would say, number one, do that. Go to the website and look at our fluency section. Number two, that's really it. That's number one. That will tell you how to combine fluency with some phonics, but it's very different for older children than it is for K1 and 2.
Great, thanks, David. And if you go to our website, achievethecore.org, you can type fluency into the search bar, and that'll be one of the first things that pops up. There's a 3-part series, as well as some fluency resources for you to just print out and use in your classroom. We're running really short on time, but David, a lot of folks were asking about maybe if you could give one piece of advice for how you could advocate for this type of instruction with administration or anyone who is making decisions in your school or district. A lot of folks are really bought into this idea. It's making sense to them, but they just don't know what to do to make this change happen.
All right. Well, some administrators are harder to convince than others. I would start with looking at your data, and I'm assuming if you answer that question that the data is not great, and just remind the principal or administrator of that. I would try to read with him the paper on structured phonics on our website. I would share with him the stories that Aaliyah told about reversing the triangle after only 1 year. And I would ask them to take a look at the National Reading Panel, maybe with you, because most principals don't read research, but try to take a look at that and see what their recommendations are. They have an executive summary in the beginning. I can't really think of anything else. The other thing you could do is ask your principal if you don't want the whole school to do this, and which is a big shift, can we do it? Can we do it using what we've learned and what we can continue learning from the Achieve the Core website? Can we make this switch now? And then after a couple of years of us doing it, then we'll turn around, look at the results, and present to the whole school. That's about it. But I think that's enough to give you a start.
David, I love those ideas. One of our participants, Mary, actually just had the same thought in the question box. Maybe convince a few teachers to pilot, and I think that could be a great way to start, as well as the Achieve the Core resources. We're going to start to wrap up here because you all have been so very fantastic. And as David said earlier, thank you for spending a bit of your summer evening with us. We've loved having you. Just a few things before we end our webinar tonight. If you haven't already joined our Core Advocate Network, we really encourage you to do so. You can just Google Core Advocate Survey, and this link will pop up for you, or when you receive the materials, go ahead and hit this hyperlink. If you sign up to join the the Core Advocates Network, you'll receive our monthly newsletter, and you'll find out about more great opportunities just like this one tonight. We also have something called the Instructional Advocacy Action Form. There'll be a link as well in the PowerPoint you received, but it's basically a way for us to find out about all the great work that you all are doing out in your schools, out in your classrooms. We love to hear about that great work because we love to tap you for great opportunities and other great things that are happening within the Core Advocate Network. So please fill that out if you're doing anything with the information you heard about tonight. And next month, we have another great webinar scheduled. It's called Don't Make Every Math Strategy a Separate Lesson, Developing Understanding and Skill with K-4 Operations. We have two fabulous guests from our very own Student Achievement Partners, Marnie and Shelby. That'll be Wednesday, August 8th. The registration link will be in the materials you receive, or if you get our monthly newsletter, you can sign right up based on that link. And really thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate you being here with us tonight. And we know this is just the beginning of a conversation about some great things we can do to change the world of our kids. So thank you so much for being with us. And we will be sending out a recording of this webinar along with the materials, and we'll try to get back with as many questions, answers to as many questions as we can. Thank you so much.